The first thing I saw when I opened my door was a drill biting into my driveway and sparks jumping across the concrete. Cold air flashing amber lights and 22 bright yellow parking bars already bolted down like prison gates. My car was trapped. My coffee was still inside, and a man in a neon vest was lining up the next hole like this was routine. Across the street, the HOA president stood with a clipboard, smiling, not even pretending to ask permission. She said my driveway was no longer mine. She said the board had voted. And just before I could answer, she added one sentence that made my stomach drop because it meant this wasn't about parking at all. Karen didn't introduce herself because she didn't think she had to. She stepped off the sidewalk and into my driveway like it was already public property heels, clicking between the yellow bars as workers kept drilling behind her. Within the first 5 seconds, she was giving orders, telling the crew to hurry up, reminding them which spots needed to be extra secure, warning them not to let me move anything. "This is an HOA enforcement action," she said, finally looking at me. "You were notified." I hadn't been, not once. She flipped her clipboard around just long enough for me to see highlighted lines and a fake-looking header before snapping it back to her chest. According to her, the board had approved a reclassification that morning. My driveway was now shared overflow parking, and I was banned from using it for my own vehicle. Street parking only, effective immediately. I told her my deed showed that strip of concrete was part of my lot. She waved it off with one sentence, said calmly like she'd practiced it. "HOA rules override personal interpretation." That was the moment I understood how she operated. One sentence of authority, no discussion, no appeal, just control. She leaned closer and dropped her voice. "If you block these bars, you'll be fined. If you touch them, you'll be fined again. And if you interfere with HOA contractors, towing is next." Around us, neighbors walked past with their heads down, pretending not to hear. Karen watched them, then looked back at me satisfied. "Compliance makes this easier," she said. "Fighting it will only get expensive." And that was when I realized she wasn't enforcing rules. She was testing how much she could take. The harassment started immediately small enough to look petty, sharp enough to sting. By that afternoon, bright orange cones appeared at the edge of my driveway, nudged just far enough in to make pulling out a tight squeeze. A laminated warning was zip-tied to my mailbox, claiming temporary enforcement in progress, no permit number, no signature. Just Karen's name printed at the bottom like a threat. That night, an HOA security car idled across the street with its headlights on, engine running. The driver sat there scrolling on his phone, occasionally glancing up at my house as if he were counting something. When I stepped outside, he rolled the window down and told me he was documenting compliance. Nothing more, nothing less. The next morning, a violation notice popped up in the HOA app. I'd been fined for attempting to obstruct shared parking access because my car was angled too close to one of the yellow bars. The fine wasn't huge, but it was immediate, and it came with a warning about escalating penalties if the behavior continued. I tried to talk to Karen again, keeping my voice, even asking how I was supposed to live without access to my own driveway. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She just pointed at the bars and said, "Street parking exists for a reason." Neighbors avoided eye contact. One woman started to say something, then stopped when Karen turned her head. Another waved awkwardly from across the road and disappeared inside. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. That was the point. She was squeezing slowly, waiting to see if I'd crack, and when I didn't, she moved the fight somewhere else. The HOA didn't come at me in person next. It came through my phone. By Monday morning, my inbox was full of board-wide emails, stamped official notice, written in stiff language that sounded like a lawyer trying to scare someone without actually saying anything illegal. They cited emergency authority, community safety, and temporary inconvenience, all wrapped around one vague claim that my driveway now fell under shared access control. Karen was copied on every message. She didn't write much herself anymore. She didn't need to. The system was talking for her. A new rule appeared in the HOA app that afternoon, quietly uploaded without a vote attached. It stated that any homeowner interfering with HOA-installed safety equipment could face daily fines and towing at the board's discretion. No end date, no appeal process listed. Then came the inspection. 2 board members I barely knew showed up with phones out taking photos of my driveway, my car, even the front of my house. They said nothing to me directly, just nodded like accountants auditing a problem. When I asked what authority they were acting under, one of them said, "We're just documenting," and the other added, "You don't want this to escalate." That word stuck with me, escalate, because it already had. I forwarded my deed to the board. I attached the survey from when I bought the house. I asked clearly and calmly how private property could be reclassified without my consent. The response came an hour later, visible to every homeowner in the app. They called me dramatic. They warned neighbors not to encourage entitlement, and they closed the comment thread. That was when I stopped trying to convince them and started trying to understand why they were pushing so hard. The answer didn't come from the HOA. It came from a PDF buried 6 folders deep on the city website. I was searching permit records late one night, not even sure what I was looking for anymore, when I noticed a familiar lot number attached to a drainage variance request filed months earlier. The address wasn't mine, but the boundary line on the map ran straight through my driveway. That was strange enough to make me keep digging. The applicant wasn't the HOA. It was a development LLC I'd never heard of. The more documents I opened, the clearer it became. The HOA had been negotiating with the city to sell access rights to a drainage corridor that cut behind several homes, including mine. On paper, it was labeled underutilized common infrastructure. In reality, it only worked if my driveway was reclassified as shared access. Without that change, the deal died, and the numbers finally explained the aggression. The proposed sale sat in the low 7 figures tied to a future apartment complex down the road. My driveway wasn't an inconvenience. It was an obstacle, one that had to disappear quietly, fast, and without a homeowner asking too many questions. I felt the shift in my chest, then the moment annoyance turns into something colder. This wasn't about rules or parking or safety. It was about money, a lot of it, and I was standing in the way. I pulled the stamped site plans from when the neighborhood was built and laid them next to the new filings. The difference jumped off the page. A boundary line had been nudged. A note added, no homeowner signatures anywhere. Someone had forged the path forward and hoped no one would notice. That night I stopped sleeping, because if they were willing to erase my property on paper for that kind of money, I knew exactly how far they might be willing to go next. I didn't confront Karen. I didn't post screenshots. I didn't warn anyone. I went where paper actually mattered. The next morning I drove to the county offices and asked for the original subdivision file tied to my lot. Not the HOA copy, the county's. The clerk disappeared into the back and came out with a thick folder held together by a cracked rubber band. When she dropped it on the counter, it landed with a dull thud that felt final. Inside were the stamped plats, the recorded easements, and the utility requirements the HOA didn't want anyone to see. My driveway was clearly marked as private access. The drainage corridor stopped short of it. No shared access, no conversion language, no emergency authority clause anywhere. I asked one quiet question. Has there been a recent amendment? The clerk frowned and pulled up her screen. There had been a filing, but it was flagged. Incomplete signatures, no homeowner consent. And the engineer of record listed on the document had retired 2 years earlier. That was when she stopped talking and called someone else over. By that afternoon, I was sitting with a county compliance officer who kept rereading the same 2 pages, tapping his pen harder each time. He said the HOA's filing triggered multiple issues: unauthorized land reclassification, false emergency designation, and interference with recorded access. Each one serious on its own. Before I left, he asked if I'd experienced any pressure or retaliation. I told him about the fines, the threats, the inspection. He nodded once and said, "Then we need to move quickly." When I got home, there was a new notice taped to my door, another fine higher this time. Karen hadn't realized it yet, but she'd just turned a neighborhood power play into a county problem. The shift happened in public. At exactly 9:03 a.m. on a Saturday, an email hit every homeowner's inbox with the subject line, "Notice of emergency meeting." No explanation, no agenda, just a date, a time, and a reminder that attendance was strongly encouraged. 2 minutes later, another email followed this one from me. I attached everything: the original stamped plats, the flagged county filing, the comparison maps with the boundary lines highlighted, the compliance officer's reference number. No commentary, no accusations, just documents and one sentence: "Please review before Monday's meeting." My phone started buzzing almost immediately. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before were texting, asking if this was real. One guy across the street knocked on my door, holding his phone out like it was evidence, asking why his property line was on a developer map he'd never seen. Someone else forwarded a message Karen had sent them months earlier, pushing for temporary cooperation near the drainage area. Then the engineer called me. He sounded tired. He said his name had been used without permission. Said he'd already contacted the county when he saw the filing go public. Said this wasn't the first time an HOA had tried something like this, but it was the sloppiest. By Sunday night, the neighborhood Facebook group was on fire. Old screenshots surfaced, petty warnings, threatening messages. patterns forming where people used to think it was just bad luck. Karen posted once late telling everyone to stay calm and trust the board. No one replied. Monday morning, a county notice appeared on the HOA bulletin board, ordering all work to stop immediately. And that afternoon, a sheriff's deputy confirmed attendance at the meeting. That was the moment I knew this couldn't be smoothed over. Whatever happened next was going to happen in front of everyone. The clubhouse was already full when I walked in, the kind of crowded silence where no one was talking because everyone was listening for something to start. Folding chairs scraped the floor as people shifted. Karen stood at the front beside the HOA banner, tapping her pen against the table like she was still in charge of the room. She opened the meeting by calling it a misunderstanding, then immediately tried to move to the next agenda item. That's when the doors opened. 2 county officials walked in, first badges clipped to their belts, followed by a sheriff's deputy who didn't bother sitting down. The room changed instantly. Phones came out. Karen froze mid-sentence, then forced a smile that didn't hold. She tried to regain control, saying this was a private HOA matter, that the board had acted in good faith under emergency authority. One of the officials calmly raised a hand and said, "This meeting is now being observed due to an active compliance investigation." Karen's voice tightened. She glanced at the board members beside her, but none of them met her eyes. The deputy stepped forward and asked her to confirm her name for the record. That was the first crack. And before she could answer, the county official added, "We'll need to address the altered filings before this meeting proceeds." The room went completely silent. The county official connected a laptop to the projector without asking permission. The HOA banner flickered, then disappeared, replaced by a clean map of our subdivision. He zoomed in slowly, methodically, until my lot filled the screen. "This is the original recorded plat," he said, "filed with the county at development." He clicked once. The second map appeared beside it. Same streets, same shapes, but one line had shifted just enough to be dangerous. A murmur rolled through the room. He highlighted the change and explained in plain language how the boundary adjustment created access that didn't legally exist. No homeowner consent, no board vote on record, no valid engineer signature. Just a filing pushed through under an emergency designation that didn't meet county standards. Then he pulled up the payment trail, a wire transfer scheduled from a development LLC to an HOA-controlled account contingent on access clearance. The amount sat just under 7 figures. Big enough to change budgets, big enough to motivate risk. Karen shook her head, laughing once too loud. She said the board knew nothing about that she was being blindsided like everyone else. That's when the engineer stood up from the back row. He said his name clearly, said he'd retired, said he'd never approved the filing, and said he'd reported the misuse of his credentials himself. The official didn't react. He just turned to Karen and asked, "Would you like to explain how your signature appears on a document you weren't authorized to file?" Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Karen tried to speak, then stopped, her eyes darting from the projector to the board members beside her like she was waiting for someone to save her. No one did. One of them slid his chair back an inch, just enough to create distance. She recovered badly. She said the paperwork must have been a clerical error. Said the developer had pressured her. Said she was only acting in the community's best interest. Each sentence contradicted the last, piling confusion on top of panic. The county official let her talk herself into a corner, then calmly listed the issues: unauthorized, land reclassification, falsified emergency filings, misuse of professional credentials, and attempted transfer of access rights. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The deputy stepped closer. Karen's tone shifted. She blamed the board. She blamed the city. She pointed toward me and said I'd caused unnecessary trouble. That was when the official stopped her and said, "Ma'am, this isn't a debate." He informed the room that the county would be referring the matter for criminal review and freezing any HOA action related to the corridor immediately. He also stated clearly that any further interference with my property would result in direct enforcement. Karen's clipboard slipped from her hands and hit the floor. The board president cleared his throat and announced her removal effective immediately, citing breach of duty. Karen protested, then went quiet when the deputy asked her to step aside. As she was escorted toward the exit, no one moved to help her. The power she'd been swinging for years vanished in under 5 minutes, and the silence she left behind was louder than anything she'd ever said. No one spoke at first. It wasn't shock so much as release, the kind that leaves a room lighter without anyone realizing why. Chairs shifted. People exhaled. A few neighbors looked at each other and shook their heads, like they were finally allowed to acknowledge what they'd all been tiptoeing around. Then someone near the back said, "So, this was happening to other houses too." That opened it. Quiet voices turned into overlapping stories, threatening emails, unexplained fines, warnings that never made sense until now. One couple admitted they'd almost sold their place just to get away from the pressure. Another neighbor apologized to me directly, saying they'd wanted to help but were scared of retaliation. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't noticed tightening before. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't bracing for the next notice or the next knock. The room didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt honest. Outside the clubhouse windows, the sun dipped low over the mesa, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The orange fencing at my yard flashed through my mind, and for the first time it felt temporary. The fear had changed sides. The county official waited for the room to settle before speaking again, his voice steady, almost clinical. He explained that the investigation would move forward immediately, and that the altered filings and attempted access transfer had already triggered multiple violations. Criminal review was being initiated, and any agreements tied to the corridor were suspended effective that moment. He added that the HOA would be required to restore all affected properties at its own expense and reimburse legal and administrative costs tied to the false emergency action. The estimated exposure, he said, sat in the mid-six figures. A ripple moved through the room as people processed what that meant. To prevent it from ever happening again, he read aloud the corrective measures: no property reclassification without written homeowner consent, third-party surveys for any easement changes, and a mandatory community vote before any external land deal. Those rules would be recorded with the county, not just tucked into HOA bylaws. Phones buzzed as an official notice hit inboxes in real time. The message was clear and final. The HOA no longer had the power to quietly rewrite reality. The meeting didn't officially end so much as dissolve. People stood in small groups talking freely now, while a board member unplugged the projector with shaking hands. My phone buzzed again, this time with a confirmation email from the county, ordering all barriers removed from my property immediately. I stepped outside and stood near the clubhouse doors, breathing in the cooling desert air. From there, I could see down the street toward my house, the orange fencing still visible in the distance, glowing under the streetlights. Not a victory yet, but close. A neighbor came out beside me and nodded toward my place. "They'll have to fix it right this time," he said. "By the book." I nodded back. That was all I wanted. Later that evening, without moving from the same spot, I watched as a contractor's truck rolled into the neighborhood to schedule the repairs. No shouting, no threats. Just work orders and permits done the way they should have been from the start. The wall would stay. The land would stay. The control was gone. I didn't need to say anything else. Sometimes, the strongest way to take your power back is to stop fighting loud and start letting the truth speak for itself. If this happened in your neighborhood, would you have stayed quiet or done the same?